Okay, good morning, everybody. First of all, I want to say that once again, my son's preschool got canceled today because a parent of one of the children was contact traced and tested positive for COVID. So I have both kids home with me. And so if I need to stop this recording and run off, that's what I'll have to do, and that'll be fine. And I'll come back on later on today or maybe even tonight and finish the recording. So my plan is to finish the respiratory system today. That way you guys can take a quiz on it. And what I'm going to do is share my screen right now just so that you can see what I've got going on in Pearson. So here's your Pearson calendar, right, in your Pearson course. The homeworks were due last night at midnight, so hopefully you guys got those done. There's also a short lab, not really a lab, but a short set of questions that I'm counting as your lab for the lymphatic system. There is a quiz on the respiratory system tomorrow night, or due by midnight tomorrow night. And then there are some questions regarding the respiratory system that will count as a lab for the respiratory system due Friday. Now, in addition to all this, in your box from Carolina Biological that got sent home, there is an experiment for respiratory physiology, which I would like you to complete as well. And so tonight I'm going to make a spot in Moodle where you can complete a couple of questions based on that and answer that. So I'll make that due. I'll give you guys a week on that. So I'll give you guys next Monday. I'll give you through the weekend so that you can do that. So I just want to make sure that you guys are up to speed on where we are. I did go in over this past week and I entered a lot of things into Moodle as far as grades go, the grades for the homework, the grades for the quizzes, those sorts of things. And I'll go in tonight and I'll enter the ones that were due last night as well. So that, I'm trying to make sure that you guys have a good idea of where you stand in the class and, what your overall point values are, what your overall grades are. As far as this goes, right, the lymphatic system and the respiratory system are the two chapters we're working on. The respiratory system will finish up today. So the other thing I want to do is just show you the syllabus again. Yeah. Just to make sure we're all on the same page with that. So here is your syllabus. Right, we are doing lymphatic system and respiratory system right now. So we're a little bit behind, right? Today is the first, and we're actually kind of right here just before the first. So what I'll do is I will post test 3 this week as well and give you guys a week to do that. That will be right on Moodle. That'll be just like tests 1 and 2. And when I post that, I'll post, I'll send you guys an email, I'll send you guys a message through Moodle saying that this is posted and this is when the due date is, this is how many questions it is, all of that sort of thing. So I'll do that this week as well. I'll try to do that tonight so that that's up there this week for you, and I'll give you a week to do that as well. And then what we are going to go into next is the digestion and the metabolism, which are chapters 24 and 25, I believe. Yeah, 24 and 25. So what I will do for that is I'll make sure that the PowerPoints are up in Moodle. They're not open to you guys yet. I'll make sure that those are up there and open for you guys so that you can go ahead and start looking at those. So without any further ado, let's go to the PowerPoint. We were talking about the respiratory system. We went over the upper respiratory system, and that's kind of where we stopped, was the upper respiratory system. So today we will get to the lower respiratory system. I'm just trying to find a good place to start. All right, so this is where we ended. Okay, and we talked about the vocal cords. We talked about taking a scope and seeing down somebody's throat, seeing their vocal cords, and that person would pass air through this opening, which is called the glottis, and it vibrates these vocal cords. Okay. From there down is your trachea, right? We mentioned the trachea and how it branches into two branches, and those main branches are called main bronchi. You have one that goes to the left lung and one that goes to the right lung. And what you're seeing here in this light purple color are the lungs. So these branches at that point enter the lungs. Okay. This is just a section through the trachea. Again, this is a cross section through the trachea through somebody's throat. And what you can see is that directly posterior to the trachea is the esophagus. The trachea is much more rigid because there are those rings of cartilage, those C-shaped rings, and the esophagus is much more collapsible. Okay. So the lower respiratory system is kind of set up like an upside down tree, right? That's called the bronchial tree. And so you can think of the trachea as the main trunk of the tree, which divides into a right and left main bronchus, right? Those are the main bronchi. And each of those goes into a lung, right? So there's two of those. One goes to the right lung, one goes to the left lung. They each then divide further. So this is once they're in the lungs. They divide further into what are called lobar bronchi, or sometimes called secondary bronchi. And those supply the lobes of the lungs. Now we'll see that the right lung has 3 lobes, the left lung only has 2, right? So we have 3 lobar bronchi on the right side and 2 on the left side. We'll see why that is in a minute. Then those bronchi branch even further into smaller branches called segmental bronchi. And then finally, each segmental bronchus, right, branches further into what are called bronchioles. And so here we go. And the bronchioles are where the actual gas exchange takes place. So if we think about this, what's in kind of blue and tan here is a respiratory tree. This is your trachea, right? Just an upside down tree. Main bronchus, secondary bronchus or lobar bronchus, tertiary bronchus or segmental bronchi. Okay, and then eventually you've got what boils down to these smaller tubes called bronchioles, right? Here's an even better illustration of that. Trachea branches into a main bronchus, which branches into lobar bronchi, which branches into segmental bronchi, which branch into these little branches, the thin little branches called bronchioles. And at the end of each bronchiole, right, each bronchiole kind of, as we get close to the end, it becomes a terminal bronchiole. And as we get to the very end, it's called the respiratory bronchiole. At the very end of every respiratory bronchiole are these sacs, these air sacs, and those are called alveoli. They look like clusters of grapes. That's where gas exchange happens. So if we think about what's happening, you're inhaling and the air is coming down the trachea, through the bronchus, right, through these bronchi, through the bronchioles. It's going to end up in these little tiny air sacs. You want to get that oxygen from there into your bloodstream. So this illustration is actually just an enlargement of the terminal bronchioles, which lead into the respiratory bronchioles, right? So these are bronchioles, which lead into these clusters called alveoli. So around each of these alveoli are hundreds or thousands of capillaries. And you can see all these blood capillaries. And the alveoli themselves have a really, really, really thin wall, right? Just one cell layer thick. And we know that the cell or the walls of the capillaries are very thin as well. They're just one cell layer thick. So the oxygen, the gas, which is inside these clusters, which are cut open right here, has to diffuse across that layer, right? Across that respiratory bronchiole layer, right, across the outermost layer of these alveoli and across one layer of cells that make up the outer layer of the epithelium, or I'm sorry, the outer layer of the capillaries, right? So the oxygen, which is in here, has to cross two layers of cells. One layer is the outside layer of these alveoli. The second layer is the outside layer of the capillary. And once it crosses those two thin layers, it gets into your bloodstream. And it goes back to your heart, back to the left atrium, to go to the left ventricle and out to the body. So here you can see an actual micrograph of lung tissue. You can see inside the alveolar sac, right? Each of these is one of those sacs on the inside, and you can see the alveoli, the clusters, and running around all of them, what you can't see in this picture, what's taken away, are capillaries running around all of them. One of the things structurally that's different when you go from bronchi to bronchioles, they're not just smaller, but the bronchioles really have no cartilage. So up until then, you have a lot of cartilage, mostly cartilage dominating these tubules. Once you get to the bronchioles, the smallest of the little tubules, they are mostly made of smooth muscle. So you can constrict or dilate them based on your needs of your body, right? So bronchodilation would open those up and allow you to take in more air. Bronchoconstriction, right, like an allergic reaction like asthma, is going to constrict those and you're going to have more trouble getting air in. So again, the air is in these alveoli, in these clusters. It has to diffuse across the outside layer of the alveoli. That's just one cell layer thick. And it has to diffuse across the capillaries, which are also just one cell layer thick. So it has to go across two cell layers to get into our bloodstream. And what you can see here are kind of these white spaces are where the air would be. So you've got the bronchioles and the alveolar sacs and the alveolus or the alveoli. And then what they're showing in red or in purple are the actual capillaries that are surrounding these tissues. So the alveolar cell layer, the cell layer that's surrounding these grapes, it's mostly simple squamous epithelium. Remember, simple, it's just one layer. It's squamous epithelium. It's pretty easy for the air to get across. They are, these very thin, delicate type 1 cells. That's where gas exchange happens. There are also macrophages in there, right, in that tissue. So these macrophages are, remember, the white blood cells that go around chewing up things. There are other cells called type 2 cells, right? The type 1 cells are the cells that make up the outer layer. Type 2 cells are larger and they produce a liquid called surfactant, right, which helps to lubricate your lungs. And so here is a drawing of several different alveoli, right? Each one of these clusters is kind of one of those grapes, one of those sacs. And you can see that the cells surrounding those, which are purple here with the darker purple dot in the middle, which is the nucleus, those are the type 1 cells. Those are just one cell layer thick. You can see that the outside of this is just one cell layer thick. There are these type 2 cells, which have this kind of tan thing on the outside of them. In this particular drawing, type 2 cells produce surfactants. And there are macrophages in some of these clusters. Macrophages are just white blood cells that are patrolling the area. So what is surfactant? It is kind of like an oil, like a lubricant. This coats the alveolar surface and reduces surface tension. So when you're breathing, your lungs are changing size. Right? As we inhale, they expand. As we exhale, they constrict. And so instead of those lungs rubbing up against anything, right, and actually causing surface tension and having friction, the surface of them is coated with this oily substance called surfactant so that they can move, they can be lubricated and move against each other easier. Again, your oxygen that you breathe is in the alveolus, right? So it's in here. It has to get across this alveolar cell layer and the cell layer that makes up the outer layer of the capillary so that it can get into the middle of the capillary. So oxygen has to diffuse across those two layers of cells to get to a red blood cell. So now they go back and they talk about kind of the gross anatomy of the lungs. We do have two lungs, a left and a right. They're not equal in size. The right lung has 3 lobes, the left one only has 2. And that is in part because the heart kind of sits in part of the space that would be occupied by the left lung. So we look at if we look at a cadaver, I mean, this is where the heart is. So you've got your right lung, which is bigger than your left lung. The lobes of the lungs are separated by these kind of long crevices called fissures. So in the right lung, you have a superior, a middle, and an inferior lobe. The left lung, you just have the superior and the inferior. It's only 2 lobes, and you have this little cutout called the cardiac notch. That's where the heart sits. Okay, each lung at the top of the lung, which is all the way up by your collarbone or clavicle, that's called the apex. That's the point. And then it comes down to, so it's almost like a triangle. It comes down to a base at the bottom. Right, the base is just the wide part at the bottom, and the apex is kind of the more pointy part at the top. And here you can see both lungs kind of turned sideways. So both lungs have an area where the main bronchus enters, right? And that's the same place where there is a pulmonary artery and 2 pulmonary veins, right? There's a pulmonary artery carrying blood in, 2 pulmonary veins carrying blood away. So this is another view just from the top, just showing the heart and its orientation and how it's kind of over on the left side. So you can see why the left lung is much smaller. This is the back, right? This is your vertebrae, this is your back, this is your sternum. There are these fibrous partitions in the lungs called trabeculae. They branch repeatedly, so they divide the lobes into little smaller compartments. And with the blood supply to the lungs, you should remember from the chapter on the cardiovascular system, or it should be a review. But if you think about it, the cardiovascular system, blood runs through the right atrium and the right ventricle. It doesn't have any oxygen. So it has to go from the right ventricle to the lungs to get oxygen. So the lungs are receiving deoxygenated blood. And those are pulmonary arteries that are bringing that blood through. Remember, arteries go away from the heart. Then in the lungs, right, all those little capillaries allow for oxygen to get across the surface. Those capillaries flow back into pulmonary veins, and those pulmonary veins carry oxygenated blood back to the left atrium of the heart. The blood pressure in the pulmonary circuit is lower than that in the systemic circuit. Your heart doesn't have to push as hard to get the blood to go just to the lungs and back, right? It's not nearly as much pressure as you have to create to get the blood to your head and your fingers and your toes. Therefore, pulmonary vessels are more easily blocked by blood clots or fat or air bubbles, right? There's not as much pressure to keep that blood flowing. And when the blood is clotted or when it's blocked, it's called a pulmonary embolism, right? An embolism is just a blockage. If it happens to be around your lungs in your pulmonary circuit, it's called a pulmonary embolism. And that blockage would stop blood flow to the lobules or to the alveoli, so to that part of your lung. So you would be oxygenating a significantly less or smaller portion of blood. The lungs sit in pleural cavities. They're separated by the mediastinum. That's where your heart sits, in the mediastinum. Each pleural cavity contains a lung. The lungs are surrounded by the pleura, which are serous membranes, and serous membranes contain 2 layers, right? So all serous membranes contain 2 layers. So again, when you're breathing, the lungs are moving. When you're inhaling, they're expanding. When you're exhaling, they're constricting. You don't want your lungs rubbing up against the inside of your rib cage, right? And so you have a layer that surrounds, or a membrane that surrounds the lungs, and then a membrane that lines your rib cage. So those 2 layers, right? The one that covers your lungs is the innermost layer. That's called the visceral pleura. And the one that lines the inner surface of your rib cage, your thoracic wall, is called the parietal pleura. So now when you're breathing, those 2 layers are rubbing against each other. And there's actually a little space between them that's filled with lubricating fluid, like oil, and that's called pleural fluid, so that those 2 layers can slide against each other without friction building up. Okay. So respiration, you have to learn about and understand about. When we say respiration, we normally just think of breathing, but there's external and internal respiration. External respiration has to do with taking up or exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide with the external environment. This external respiration is what happens in your lungs, right? When you actually get air from your lungs, oxygen from your lungs into your cardiovascular system. So what we've been talking about, the air gets from the alveoli into the capillaries, that's external respiration. Internal respiration is once that blood goes back to the heart through the left side of the heart and goes to the body and gets to the body. So maybe in your leg, in the muscle of your leg, oxygen's getting out of your blood, carbon dioxide's getting into your blood. That's internal respiration. Okay, so external respiration happens in the lungs. Internal respiration happens in other places in your body, other systems of your body. Make sure that you understand the differences between external and internal respiration. So again, here they show you external respiration is in the lungs. This is what's happening in the lungs. Whereas internal respiration is happening in the rest of your body. Okay, pulmonary ventilation is breathing, just a fancy word of saying breathing, getting air into and out of your respiratory tract. And atmospheric pressure is something that's talked about a lot with pulmonary ventilation. We'll talk about this a little bit. That's just the pressure of the gas in the atmosphere around your body. So to understand a little bit about pulmonary ventilation, we have to understand Boyle's law. Boyle's law says that pressure and volume are inversely related in a gas. So when pressure goes up, volume goes down. When volume goes up, pressure goes down. That's it, right? Pressure equals 1 over volume. So as pressure increases, volume decreases. That's it. Keep that as simple as you can. So when we are breathing, right, the respiratory cycle is breathing. Inhaling is called inspiration and exhaling is called expiration. This process of inspiration and expiration is due to atmospheric pressure. It's due to pressure changes. Here's what happens. Our lungs are a certain size. When we inhale, a bunch of muscles make our lungs bigger. So the volume of our lungs is bigger. Now, if the volume is bigger, the pressure is lower, right? As volume goes up, pressure goes down. So that means that the lungs get bigger, the pressure inside them goes down. There is some pressure, there's some atmospheric pressure, right? There's some pressure of the gases in the atmosphere around us. So when we inhale, we're decreasing the pressure inside our lungs, such that the pressure in the atmosphere is higher than the pressure inside our lungs. Air is going to want to go into our body. That's how we inhale. When we exhale, we do just the opposite. We use a different set of muscles, or relaxed muscles in some cases, And what happens is our lungs get smaller, right? We compress our lungs. So the volume gets smaller. When the volume gets smaller, the pressure gets bigger, right? Volume goes down, pressure goes up. What that causes is for the volume or for the pressure in our lung to be higher than the pressure in the atmosphere around us. And the oxygen or the air, I should say, the air is always going to want to move from high pressure to low pressure. So that causes the air to move out of our body, right? So taking air in, the lungs get bigger, pressure drops, air comes in. When we're exhaling, we squeeze the lungs get smaller, pressure rises, air gets forced out. That's all that's going on, right? That's what they're saying over and over and over again. Now they're talking about the different muscles that move and that cause your ribs and your sternum to elevate so that your lungs get bigger when you inhale. And then when you relax those muscles, they shrink back down so your lungs get smaller, right? So at rest, you can see this is at rest. You can see when you inhale, the arrows are showing that your chest gets bigger so that you can draw air in. When you're exhaling, your chest gets smaller, which causes you to force air out. There are primary respiratory muscles. These are the muscles that are primarily responsible for making your rib cage bigger and therefore your lungs bigger, increased in size. And there are accessory ones, right? So if you were to take a really deep breath, you would actually use extra muscles. And normal breathing, inhalation is active, right? You have to contract these muscles in order to make your chest cavity bigger. Exhalation is usually passive. Usually you're just relaxing those muscles and it causes your chest to go back to a smaller size, right? And causes you to push air out. Now we can all forcibly exhale. We can all go and blow air out. And to do that, we're using some muscles, like our abdominal muscles, to constrict or to push against our lungs. So here are the muscles used in inhalation and exhalation, right? And it just goes through a lot of that. Okay. So we're going to keep going with pulmonary ventilation, respiratory rates, and volumes. So now that hopefully you understand a little bit about how we take air in, oftentimes you want to know what your respiratory rate is and what the volume is, right? You want to know how many times you're inhaling and exhaling in a minute, and you want to know how much air you're getting into your body. And so the number of breaths per minute, that's the respiratory rate. So that's like, right, your pulse is the number of heartbeats per minute, respiratory rate is the number of breaths per minute. And that's inhaling and exhaling is one breath. The amount of air moved per breath is called tidal volume. Right, so if you wanted to know the amount of air you're moving in a minute, which is respiratory minute volume, you take your tidal volume, how much you move in one breath, and you multiply it by how many breaths you take in a minute. But only some of the air that you inhale reaches those alveoli. Remember, it's got to go through a lot of different structures to get down to those alveoli. So the volume of air remaining in your conducting passages is called anatomic dead space. Right? There's a certain volume of air every time we inhale and exhale that does not make it all the way down to those alveoli, and it's not going to be involved in getting oxygen into your bloodstream. So what you're really interested in is the amount of air that does reach those alveoli each minute, and that's called alveolar ventilation. And here's how that's calculated. You take your tidal volume, which is how much air you can take in a breath, or how much air is moved in one breath, and you subtract your anatomic dead space, which is just usually an estimation, and you multiply that by how many breaths you have in a minute. Okay, so it's less, it's a smaller number, because you're actually not getting all of the air to your alveoli every time you breathe. So then there are just different relationships that are given. For a given respiration rate, increasing tidal volume increases alveolar ventilation. Like if you increase how much air you're taking in, then you increase how much air is getting into those alveoli. It's still less than how much you take in, but you're increasing it. For any given tidal volume, increasing the respiratory rate increases the alveolar ventilation rate. So if you increase how many breaths you take in a minute, you can get more breath, more air into those alveoli. And a lot of this is measured with a device called a spirometer. So if you go to the doctor, right, if they're looking at your breathing, they're looking at your lung capacities, they want to measure a lot of these different numbers. And they use that with a machine called a spirometer. The spirometer basically measures how much air you exhale. So you breathe into this thing, and there's a gauge on it, and there's a bunch of different types, but they are measuring how much air you're breathing in. So in the lab kit that was sent home to you guys, there is a makeshift spirometer. And so I'm going to kind of demonstrate that in another recording that I'm going to make. But it's basically just a long bag that as you breathe into it, there's markings on the bag. And so you can estimate how much air you're pushing into that bag. Okay, so pulmonary volumes that they want to know about. Tidal volume, which we've talked about. That's the amount of air moved into and out of your lungs in a breath. Expiratory reserve volume, the additional amount of air capable of being exhaled. So tidal volume is just your normal breathing, normal walking around everyday breathing, how much air gets in and out. But we can all exhale past that, right? You can breathe normally and then go try to get rid of as much air as you can. The difference between the tidal volume and how much you get out, that's your expiratory reserve volume. That's how much you can exhale past your tidal volume. Residual volume is how much air is left in your lungs after that maximal exhalation. So after you go and you feel like you've blown out whatever air is in your lungs, there's still air in your lungs. You can't completely get rid of all the air in your lungs. They would collapse. And so that's called residual volume. Okay, that's just a small, not small, but an amount of air that's always in your lung. Inspiratory reserve volume is the additional amount of air that can be inhaled. So again, you're breathing, you're not thinking about it at all. We don't think about breathing as we're walking around, but we can all inhale past what we normally breathe, and that's called the IRV. So exhaling past what you normally breathe is ERV, inhaling past what you normally breathe is IRV. Other numbers that they want to know. The entire inspiratory capacity. If you add your tidal volume plus your IRV, that's the total amount you can get in one deep, inhalation. So they want to know that, right? A doctor would want to know how much air can you really get in. Functional residual capacity is your ERV plus your residual volume, right? That's the air that's not moving. Your residual volume is the air that doesn't go anywhere, it doesn't go out. Your vital capacity is your ERV plus your tidal volume plus your IRV. It's how much you can inhale and exhale in one breath. If you were to take the biggest inhale and the biggest exhale that you could, that's vital capacity, right? So to me, that's almost like the opposite of tidal volume. Tidal volume is just walking around, not thinking about breathing, how much do you get in and out. Vital capacity is how much can you forcibly get in and out of your lungs. And then your total lung capacity is your vital capacity plus your residual volume. Now we know that residual volume does not participate in oxygen exchange at all. This doesn't count for what gets into your bloodstream. This is just what's there, keeping your lungs, keeping your lungs inflated. And here's how all of this kind of looks on a chart, right? So this little curve in the middle here between 2200, 2700, that's what you take in each breath. So they estimate about 500 milliliters is what you take in every breath. But look, you can force out more than that. You can force out another 1,000 mils. You can forcibly inhale another several thousand mils. And so going from this lowest bottom to this highest top peak, that is your vital capacity. right? That's how much you can inhale and exhale in one breath. Below that, right, notice that this doesn't start at zero. Zero is all the way down here because you've got this residual volume, right? You've got this volume of air that's in your lungs. It doesn't go anywhere. So they estimate that around 1,200 mils. And you've got that extra, everything is built on top of that 1,200 mils. Now they give you a chart for males and for females, and the numbers are slightly different. The numbers tend to be a little bit higher for males. They tend to have a little bit more of a lung capacity. That's only because the average male is bigger than the average female. That's the only reason, right? If you have more body mass, you have more tissues that need oxygen, then the lungs will tend to be bigger just because then you get more air, more oxygen to those tissues. That's the only reason. So all of that, right, which is something that you'll do in lab. Again, we'll use this makeshift spirometer that we have, this bag that we'll breathe into. What you're measuring most of the time in lab, you're measuring the tidal volume, you're measuring ERV. You can measure your vital capacity. You can measure what you can breathe into the bag, right? You can exhale into a bag and measure that volume. What you have trouble doing, what you really can't do most of the time, is measure how much you inhale. And so these numbers that are inhaling, like IRV, have to be calculated from the ERV and the tidal volume and the vital capacity. And so there's a worksheet that goes through that and shows the exact calculations and how to get there. But just understand that in the real world, you can measure how much you can breathe into something, how much you can forcibly push air into something. It's a lot harder to measure how much air you're taking into your lungs yourself. So all of that had to do with slides here, with Whose law. All of that has to do with whose law was it? Yes, Boyle's law. Right? All of that, all of the breathing air in and everything has to do with Boyle's law. Then we get to a point where we've gone through all of that, right? And we talk about diffusion of gases. Now, Boyle's law says that gases want to go from a high concentration to a low concentration, right? And that's how they went from a high pressure to a low pressure. That's how we got air in. We went from a high pressure in our lungs to a low pressure outside. That's how we got air out. Diffusion of gases depends on partial pressures. And so here's where we get into Dalton's law. Each gas contributes to the total pressure in proportion to its relative abundance. So each gas that's in your lungs, if we're talking about in your lungs or in the atmosphere, we'll start off in the atmosphere. So this is the air around us. Each gas makes up a percentage of the total pressure, right? So in the atmosphere, it's mostly nitrogen, oxygen, some water vapor, which is hydrogen and oxygen, and carbon dioxide. And you can see that nitrogen makes up almost 80% of the gas in our atmosphere. So most of the pressure in our atmosphere is due to nitrogen, since that's the most abundant gas in our atmosphere. Okay. Then we also get into something called Henry's law. And this will all come together in a minute. Henry's law says that at a given temperature, the amount of gas in a solution is proportional to the partial pressure of that gas. So when a gas under pressure contacts a liquid, pressure forces gas molecule into solution. At equilibrium, gas molecules diffuse out of liquid as quickly as they enter it. The number of gas molecules in the solution is constant. So basically, it's just saying, again, that gas wants to go from higher pressure to lower pressure. When you put the gas under enough pressure, and it comes in contact with the liquid, it forms a solution. It goes from being a gas to being a liquid. And this will keep happening until the number of gas molecules in the solution is constant, until they reach equilibrium. So when you talk about this, right, when you talk about Henry's law, you have to think about the solubility of gases in bodily fluids. So in some places in your body, well, I shouldn't say that. CO2 is something that's highly soluble, right? You can easily get that into a liquid. Oxygen is somewhat less soluble. Nitrogen has really limited solubility. So these three gases, CO2, oxygen, and nitrogen, are all in the atmosphere. CO2, it's really easy to get CO2 to form a liquid, right? Very easy to get it into a liquid state. Oxygen's pretty easy to get into a liquid state. Nitrogen's really hard to get into a liquid state. So what that means is that our bodies have evolved to use carbon dioxide and oxygen for their functions, and not nitrogen. So even though nitrogen is really abundant, 80% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, we aren't using that for gas exchange. We aren't using that for different reactions in our bodies because it's really hard to get that solubilized, to turn it to a liquid. So here are the partial pressures in the plasma of the pulmonary vein. Now, the plasma is the liquid part of the blood. Pulmonary veins are leading from your lungs to your heart. Right? The partial pressures, carbon dioxide is about 40 millimeters of mercury, oxygen 100 millimeters of mercury, nitrogen 573. So of these, right, the lowest one is carbon dioxide. That's going to be the easiest one to get into a liquid form. Okay. Direction and rate of diffusion are determined by differing partial pressures and solubilities. So if we looked at the pulmonary artery, these pressures are going to be different especially for the CO2 and the oxygen. Okay. Or if we look in the capillaries in the body, these are going to be different as well. We'll get to that in a second. So external respiration. This is the respiration that's happening in your lungs, right? This is in your lungs, the capillaries in your lungs are taking up oxygen, giving up carbon dioxide. So the blood arriving in the pulmonary arteries has low oxygen, low pressure of oxygen, and a high pressure of carbon dioxide. This is blood that's leaving the right ventricle of the heart to go to the lung. Right? This is blood that's deoxygenated. It needs oxygen. It has a lot of carbon dioxide. It's bringing carbon dioxide from the tissues to your lungs. Because it has high carbon dioxide is going to want to flow from where it's highest to where it's lowest. Well, it's highest in those arteries, right? So it's going to want to flow out of those arteries and those capillaries into the lung. Oxygen is going to tend to be higher in the lungs, in the alveoli, than it is in these capillaries, right? Because there's low amounts of oxygen in these capillaries. So oxygen wants to go from the lungs into the capillaries. So this gradient is what causes oxygen to enter the blood and CO2 to leave the blood in your lungs. Then we get to the other side of that, right? That blood takes up oxygen, gives up CO2, comes back through pulmonary veins, back through the left atrium, the left ventricle, goes to the body. Now it's going to the body. There's a lot of oxygen in those vessels. There's very little carbon dioxide. So what happens? Oxygen's high in the vessels. It gets to the tissues. It's going to want to flow from where it's high to where it's low. It's high in the vessels, low in the tissue. It's going to diffuse out of the blood vessels and into the tissues. Carbon dioxide is high in the tissues and low in the vessels. Carbon dioxide is going to want to go from the tissues into the vessels. Right? So just the opposite of this. It's the opposite situation of external respiration. The blood in internal respiration has high oxygen, low CO2. Okay? So it's the opposite of the lungs. And so what happens is CO2 diffuses into the blood, oxygen diffuses out of the blood. And through these processes, that's how oxygen and CO2 just get shuttled around the body over and over and over again. And then finally, this goes into gas transport. I think this is the last. Oh, no. So gas transport, how do those gases get around the body? The blood has to transport oxygen and carbon dioxide. It can't transport enough for physiological means. Red blood cells transport oxygen and carbon dioxide. Oxygen is usually bound to hemoglobin. That's how it gets transferred around. Right? And you can go through the curve and everything else. But when we get to carbon dioxide transport. So carbon monoxide is a problem because blood cells bind to that stronger than they bind to oxygen. So CO is around. They will bind to that rather than oxygen. Then you're not getting oxygen to your tissues anymore. That's why CO becomes a poison. Carbon dioxide can be carried 3 ways in the blood. So oxygen pretty much just binds to the red blood cell, and that's how it's carried, right? Carbon dioxide, some of it gets bound to hemoglobin, but some of it's actually just dissolved into the plasma. And some of it, a large portion of it, the largest portion of it, gets converted to carbonic acid in your blood. Okay, so 70% is transported as bicarbonate ions. It gets converted to bicarbonate and therefore carbonic acid. What this does is it maintains your blood pH, right? This is really important because it keeps the blood pH somewhere around 7.35 or 7.45, keeps it from getting too high or too low. Most of the carbon dioxide is transported as bicarbonate ions, right? 70% of it is not bound to red blood cells. It's transported as these bicarbonate ions. Only about 23% is bound to hemoglobin, whereas something like 98% of oxygen is bound to hemoglobin. Only about 23% is bound to hemoglobin. So this is the CO2. These are the CO2 molecules that bind to hemoglobin, get carried back to your lungs, you exhale, you get rid of that. And then about 7% is transported as dissolved gas molecules in the plasma. Okay, so here you can see carbon dioxide transport in the blood. 93% diffuses into the red blood cells. Only about 23% though is bound to the hemoglobin. About 70% is converted to carbonic acid, which you can see here how it maintains blood pH. I'm not going to go into it. So the primary gas transport mechanisms, again, most oxygen, right, almost 100%, like 98%, binds to hemoglobin and is carried around the body by the red blood cell. Very different than carbon dioxide, where 70%, most of the carbon dioxide, is actually converted to carbonic acid and transported around the body that way. And so then we get into control of respiration. There is local regulation of respiration. We don't think about controlling our respiratory rates, but if CO2 levels start to rise, what happens is your smooth muscle and the arterioles, the capillaries relax, and it increases blood flow so that you're getting more oxygen in, right, which should lower CO2 levels. We have respiratory centers in the brain so that when oxygen demand rises, your respiratory rates increase under neural control. So these are, again, these are involuntary. These are things you don't think about, but think about when you start to exercise again, right? When you get on a treadmill or you start running a race or whatever, you start playing whatever sport you're playing, as you start to move around and run around, the oxygen demand rises. You're using your muscles more, you need more oxygen. And so what happens is there's parts of your brain, there are signals from your brain to your lungs that tell you to increase your respiratory rates. Now, a lot of that is involuntary. There are some voluntary aspects to that, right? You can voluntarily use your muscles to change the size of your thoracic cage. The voluntary centers are in your cerebral cortex. The respiratory centers, right, are 3 pairs of nuclei in the reticular formation of your medulla oblongata and your pons. So that's the back of your brain, your very primitive brain. Your respiratory rate is established by your medulla oblongata. So again, this is your primitive brain. This is all involuntary. And so something like the DRG functions in quiet and forced breathing. This is what you're using all the time, every day to breathe. You're not thinking about it, but there are little signals going from the medulla oblongata of your brain to these muscles that surround your lungs. The ventral respiratory group functions only in forced breathing. So this is only when you want to inhale or exhale, exhale forcibly, that you're stimulating more neurons or stimulating muscles to activate those muscles to inhale further, right, or to exhale. There are also apnoistic and pneumotactic centers of your brain. So they are, again, they are monitoring things like how much CO2 is in your bloodstream, and they are adjusting your breathing based on that. They can promote passive or active exhalation based on the contents of your blood. So the rest of this just goes into respiratory control. These respiratory centers are strongly influenced by chemoreceptor input from these different cranial nerves. So you learned about cranial nerves in the nervous system, right? In ANP1, the end of ANP1. So your glossopharyngeal nerves and your vagus nerves. Your vagus nerve has a lot to do with your respiration and your heart rate. But also there's chemoreceptors. There's receptors that look at the blood pH or how much oxygen is there at your carotid arteries. So if the oxygen levels are too low, if they're not high enough, you're going to change your rate to try to get more oxygen in. If it's too high, you're going to change your rate to have shallower breathing. And those pH and oxygen receptors are both in the carotids and in the aorta. So pretty much right where blood is leaving the heart. There are other chemoreceptors that monitor cerebral spinal fluid. They are responding to high rates of carbon dioxide and the pH of your cerebral spinal fluid. So all of that information leads to how deep you breathe, right, and the rate of respiration. So not just how quickly you're breathing, but how much air you're getting in with each breath. And it goes through some of what some of these different reflexes are, apnea, things like that. Age-related changes. So before birth and newborns, pulmonary vessels are collapsed. The lungs contain no air, right? When you're in the womb, you don't breathe air. We all have gills. We're all surrounded by liquid. During delivery, there is no placental connection, obviously. So that's when the oxygen pressures fall dramatically and the CO2 pressures rise. And hopefully that's when the newborn overcomes that surface tension and inflates the bronchial tree, inflates their lungs to take their first breath. And then effects of aging, right? A lot of these tissues are elastic. And so as we age, the elasticity decreases. And so you have a harder and harder time taking air in. And sometimes getting air from the alveoli into your capillaries. Emphysema is something that's common in older individuals, especially people who smoke or were exposed to certain respiratory irritants, maybe if you worked in a factory or something like that. What happens is there's a lot of, it's almost like scar tissue that is built up, and basically the alveoli are no longer these air sacs. They're kind of just these big empty areas. And so there's no place for you to have this gas exchange from the alveoli into your capillary. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I'm going to post this recording tonight. Like I said, I am going to ask that you guys perform the experiment about ventilation, about breathing. I'm going to post a little bit of information on that in the next day or two. I'll also post exam 3, and I'll post the next couple of chapters that we're working on, the digestive system and the metabolism, so that you can get jump start on those. Please email me if you have any questions. If you see something that looks really wrong in your grade book or something like that, email me and let me know what's going on. And I hope you guys have a great day, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.